right, yeah. Up it comes, John. Now, I'm thinking you're better on. Right. Can you put this one side, man? Bad, right. Yeah. You're right. I'll go up the side, Tom. Let that go round.
The warehouse of the Tate Gallery. The Dubuffet canvases go out, and a strange assembly of objects and paintings come in. Almost every piece of work that Duchamp's ever done is here.
Up in its correct relationship to the perspective over here. And that means getting this axis in line with the axis of the mill wheel over here. Yes.
Richard Hamilton, a painter and friend of Duchamp, has organized the exhibition.
That's been redrawn, so if you can get that line coinciding with this one and carrying right through to the other one there. Yeah.
Duchamp ceased from formal artistic activity in 1923, and yet no artist working today can afford to ignore his ideas. His work shows the dilemma of modern art. It shows a crisis, a stop, and a series of fresh starts. Duchamp at the age of 9, between his mother and nurse. His family lived in Normandy. He was the third of 6 children. His 2 older brothers, Jacques Villon and Raymond Duchamp Villon, were respectively a painter and sculptor. They were also his teachers when he first came to Paris. This is Duchamp at 17, drawn by his brother. The village church where he was baptized. His brother Jacques Villon's house seen through the apple trees. Duchamp was 18 and already a skillful impressionist when he painted this actor friend of Villon's while on holiday on the Normandy coast.
How old were you when you first started painting?
I was 15, or at least, well, I drew all the time, all my young years, but the first painting I remember, and still exists, was painted in 1902, when I was 15 years old. And it will be in the Tate Gallery, I think. It will be shown, that painting.
What is that painting?
It's a landscape, very impressionistic, pseudo-impressionistic, because it's not real, but influenced by Impressionism at that time. It was the great school of things, of paintings at that time.
Was it very natural for you to become a painter?
More or less so, because my family was a family of artists. My grandfather was an etcher, engraver, and my 2 brothers were 10 and 12 years older than me, and started painting when I was still a baby, and so I followed suit.
His father was a notary, an easygoing, generous man who supported his painter family into manhood. There were no pressures. The family, or friends of the family, provide the subject matter for these early works. All were given away. Duchamp has hardly ever sold a picture. These nudes, painted when he was in his early 20s in 1910 and 11, at the beginning of the Fauve revolution against Impressionism, show Duchamp's astonishing facility, which very soon ceased to satisfy him. He looks on these works as quite ordinary trials within the current framework. But even here there's a refusal to repeat himself, a continual experimenting with styles. Monet, Bonnard, Derain, Matisse, Cézanne, there are elements of them all. And then, still in 2 years, 1910 and 11, Cubism. And these chess players, a theme that's very close to Duchamp. And, for the first time, a way out of sensuous painting into a drier, more analytical approach. Finally, in 1912, a big and shocking break. Nude descending a staircase, presented at the Exhibition of Independent Artists.
It was really refused at the Independence a few months earlier. It was not refused because you don't refuse a painting at the Independent. There was no jury, as you know. But nevertheless, there were some objections on the part of my fellow cubists. And I decided not to show it. And before the show opened, I went and took the painting back home, which I felt was the right thing to do for me. And it was already a departure at that time, a point of departure for deciding that it was more important to paint for oneself than to paint to show, and I really never showed again very much anymore, except in America.
Yes. Can you the nude descending a staircase was what was in a way a great break from the kind of cubism?
For me, yes, it was evidently, yes, it was. It was from my way of understanding cubism. It's a form of, there's of course a little, not influence, but a little similarity with futurism. Although I never knew them at that time, only knew Severini much later, I mean 1913 and 14. But for me it was a great break, of course, from Impressionism and Fauvism and all the movements before. And the painting was shown in New York then in 1913. And that was supposed to be a break in my life because it was a succès de scandale, and I took advantage of it.
Where did you get your idea of movement from?
From probably the physicist Mare and the Englishman Muybridge, and also the American painter Eakins, I don't know. The three of them were, I think Muybridge was also a physicist of some kind. And Mare and Muybridge corresponded a lot, but far back until from 1880 on. They had a very important correspondence and studied what was to become this moving pictures, cinema. And they invented all kinds of things. I think Mare invented a special rifle to shoot pictures the way for cinema. And these things were mentioned in illustrated magazine with photos of his sketches and so forth. Those photos gave me the idea of using it for a painting, see, as a point of departure.
And your idea was to depict the moment of change, was it?
Yes, not to give an impression of movement. That was not in my head at all. It was, on the contrary, a diagrammatic form of depicting what the movement is supposed to be, I mean, mechanically speaking.
At 25, Duchamp had played his own part in Impressionism, Fauvism and Cubism, and moved on. From now on, everything is one story, his own exploration of entirely new territory. Here's Richard Hamilton.
There was one moment, though, which I feel is more crucial than others, and that was in 1912, after he'd painted the New Descending a Staircase. Everything that he'd done before that time made some kind of sense in the context of Parisian painting of the period. The New Descending a Staircase, even although it was unlike anything being done in Paris, was at least related to the Futurist work in Italy. But after that, he went to Munich for a short period, and he couldn't speak the language, he worked in absolute isolation, and during that time he produced some very extraordinary paintings and drawings. There was one painting in particular which is called The Passage from the Virgin to the Bride, which is a very transitional work in every sense. It is a transition between certain drawings which he called Virgin and a painting which he did later called Bride. And the Bride painting emerges from the Passage painting very directly. But it tightens down on it. It finds static forms out of the language of motion. And the way that the Bride painting is significant in crystallizing down on these ideas of movement, there's another painting called The Chocolate Grinder, which was done shortly after his return to Paris, in which he is taking an idea of movement rather than describing in an illustrative way the possibilities of something moving. He takes something which can't have any meaning unless it is simply that of motion. And he paints it almost as an emblem. It's a kind of device which stands for motion.
When you painted the Chocolate Grinder, you were trying to get away from the craft of the hand, using the hand.
Yes, yes. Also that's very important. Up to that epoch, around 1910-12, the great thing was the patte, what they call in French the patte, which means the hand. The hand, you know, there's certain arabesque that your hand always makes, like Toulouse-Lautrec and even every artist, or even Velasquez, you see. I mean, there's something which belongs to the hand, not to the mind. And I thought probably at that time that using a bit of the mind wouldn't be bad.
For the next 11 years, until 1923, and on and off for the rest of his life, Duchamp launched a series of perfectly calculated humorous attacks on what was and what was not a work of art. He had already introduced the idea of movement, which was to occur again and again, and of painting as a diagram, a kind of blueprint devoid of any sensuous appeal. Now he turned to chance and to choice. First he applied chance to the laws of measurement, which are generally taken for granted, but which for Duchamp are just arbitrary approximations. He made his own measures.
I used 3 threads, a meter long, and dropped it from a meter high on a horizontal surface. And whatever the shape the thread in falling took, when it arrived on the bottom, at the bottom, I would keep exactly as it fell. And to fix it, I just fixed it with varnish, drops of varnish. And this operation repeated 3 times gave me what they call the standard stoppages, which I am very proud of because I think it's an interesting part, especially being the meter long. It was a unit of length treated in an aesthetic form.
This was a way of tracking chance.
Yes, yes, I even call it canned chance.
Air of Paris, 50 cubic centimeters, in a specially made glass phial. Cage with cuttlebone and thermometer containing lumps of sugar, which turn out to be cubes of marble, by Rose C'est la Vie. Hat rack, chosen in 1917. Duchamp calls these objects ready-mades, Were they a comment on the ridiculous price paid for a painter's signature? Were they drawing attention to objects which were just as much works of art as accepted works of art? Or were they a joke? The essential thing is that they were chosen by the artist.
Ready-made is, see, first, in the first place, when I first started, I didn't have the word at my disposal. I had not invented the word yet, or at least taken in. For example, in that bicycle wheel, see here, it was 1913, it was in Paris. I didn't, the word didn't exist. The thought did not exist in my mind of something like that. It just happened to be some kind of a bicycle wheel in my studio just for fun, the way you have a fire in the fireplace as a sort of distraction, a movement again, probably. That was probably the first expression of movement. It was just after the nude, and it went with the idea of movement, you know. Well, then, after that, in 14, I had a thing called the bottle rack. It was a dryer for bottles, you know, made of iron, manufactured. And I just chose it, and that's what the definition of a ready-made is the choice of the artist is enough to transfer it from a functional or industrial form into supposed to be aesthetic, but very different from aesthetic in general. The independence incident, when I sent that urinal to be shown, is one incident. The jury, there was no jury, but the people who were organizing it decided it couldn't be shown, that urinal. So instead of, they didn't know it was I was concerned with it because I didn't sign my name, as you know, with the Mutt name instead. So they just took the thing and threw it away above the partition. So it was between partitions and you couldn't see it. It was hidden. In fact, we didn't know where it was for the whole length of the show. It only at the end that we found it behind the partition and we recuperated it.
And what about the Gioconda?
Gioconda was another thing that I made here in Paris in 1919 before going back to America. And, well, it was one of these gestures because I added an inscription. This was another ready-made, but its own kind. But I have called ready-made aided or assisted, which means that I added something to it, which in the case of the Gioconda, I added a little moustache and a little goatee. And also wrote underneath something very risky. And that was all. That was become very important ready-made. It's only very recently that they have become of age. Before that, I had them in my studio and even lost them. Don't forget it, most of them were lost around 1930, 1925. They've kept their standing. They have kept their, because they are so much ignored by the people that they're still virginal in their showing when they're shown today. They are not in the race of artworks, you see. They are not considered artworks. So they are not in the competition of money. You don't have to spend a lot of money to have them, and you can't even have them anyway. You sort of have to sign each one. That's the essential characteristic. So they're not in the run. I mean, they don't belong.
Duchamp's ideas of movement, painting as diagram, and canned chants culminate in this picture called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even. Richard Hamilton has spent a year reconstructing it. The original in Philadelphia is too fragile to travel.
Why did you choose to do it on glass?
Because mainly the transparency of the glass. I wanted to I had always noticed that the trouble with an oil painting and easel painting is you never know how to do the background. You make a portrait or you make some scene or some still life, and then comes the background. What are you going to do in the background? You put something in the background and it's always false, or at least very seldom justified. It's just a filling up canvas. With a glass you don't have to do that. The glass is transparent, and you put anything behind you wish, and you change it every day if you wish as well. And that was for me an element of novelty to convince me I could go on with it.
The whole picture, which Duchamp worked on for 8 years, is on one level an allegory of erotic desire and frustration, seen in a complicated language of mechanical and literary terms invented by Duchamp. It's very difficult to understand. The bachelor figures at the bottom of the glass are represented by emblematic molds and are cut off from the bride above. They are activated by a gas which awakens desires that can never be satisfied. They are an endless frustration machine. Above them, the bride mechanism receives their coded messages and sends back palpitating orders. A gasoline of love flows from her. She's in a state of being continually mechanically stripped bare as she passes from virginity to the goal of her desires, shown by a cloud-like blossoming. The diagram on the glass is thus a frozen moment of endless desire and frustration.
You had to invent a whole new language.
Yes, there's also some kind of literary part to it. It was intended to have every item on the glass, every little design on the glass, explained with language, with words. It was nothing spontaneous about it, which of course is a great objection, would be a great objection on the part of aestheticians. They want the subconscious to speak by itself. I don't care. And it was the opposite in that way. So at the end of 8 years, even not finished, I decided to stop.
The last canvas Duchamp painted also used canned chance. The shadows cast by the ready-mades in his studio were incorporated into the painting. (1923), and Duchamp has made about half a dozen discoveries in as many paintings. Now he stops. His ideas are stated. Since then, he ceased to work as an artist, though he has experimented from time to time. He had destroyed the idea of the artist as sacred, but substituted his own private mystery. Now, having brought painting and life uncomfortably close together, he began to apply his ideas to his own life. He's universally admired by artists. Here are two Americans, the painter Robert Rauschenberg and the composer John Cage. First, Rauschenberg.
I've always found it difficult to talk about Marcel Duchamp's work specifically, because I think that he means more to me as a man who has pursued a particular point of view that was uncommon and remains uncommon. The fact that he approached each of his pieces as though that was the only thing that he was going to do. His recognition of the lack of art in art and the artfulness of everything, I think, is probably his most important contribution.
Late in the 50s, I went to an exhibition of Dada in Düsseldorf. And of all it was quite a complete show, but of all the work there, almost all of it had become art, except, and perhaps for this reason and others, the pun reason, the work of Duchamp remained something that invited one and sharpened one's awareness outside, to something outside the work itself. So that as one went around the rooms of that exhibition, because of the Duchamp, one noticed the handles of doors, vents in the walls and ceilings and so forth. Now I want to turn all of the work of Duchamp in this direction to the pun, that is, to the word that would mean not just art or not just life, but both of them. We don't perhaps have that word, but if Duchamp had been here, say at the beginning when language was invented, we might very well have had such a word.
1924, a year after the large glass picture, Duchamp in Paris, acting out some of his jokes. Here, in a false beard, he's illuminated for a split second as Adam in a ballet by Eric Satie. He appears with the photographer Man Ray in a surrealist film by René Clair. Since his stoppage in 1923, the Duchamp myth has blossomed effortlessly. He's remained in the art world, untied to any clique, never succumbing to his disciples. For a time, he earned the little money he needed by speculating in pictures. He bought on commission for his friend and the great collector of his works, Walter Arensberg. He gave French lessons for a time, ran a small dyeing business which went broke, and helped organize occasional exhibitions. He's always lived very modestly, though he could have had great wealth if he'd painted on. In 1924, he tried some more play with chance on an expedition to Monte Carlo, intending to break even plus 10%, again wanting neither too much nor too little. He floated alone from his friends on bonds bearing his own photograph disguised as a devil.
I thought that also could be channelized. Chance could be channelized into a system which has, I did not invent that. Every man in Monte Carlo, playing Monte Carlo, has a system. But I thought I might find one that would work. And it might work on such long calculation of probabilities that you'd have to live 25,000 lives to get to a result of the probabilities playing in your favor. And plus the zero and all these things that the Monte Carlo has taken care of before against the gamblers.
How long did you persevere for?
How long I stayed there?
Yes.
Oh, not very long. I worked at it for a year or two on they call Permanence. It is a newspaper, a paper they publish. Every week they publish one sort of tabulation of all the numbers that came out on a certain table. And from that you can make deductions and conclusions and find sometimes a repetition and so forth, a system in other words. But even that, you have to, for example, I remember that I used to play one time every half hour or so. So it was so boring again. It seems that boredom has been in my life a lot. Even that didn't work, and I stopped.
When did you first start doing mechanical optical?
Yes. Well, that was later, 34, I did those discs. No, in first place, no, I had one in 1925, that's right, 24, 25, of the spiral turning to give the idea of the screw, the corkscrew effect. And then that was black and white, and I made a little film of it called anemic cinema. And then 10 years later, taking the same idea again, I amplified it by adding, recreating the object. And so those first drawings were abstract spirals. And then I discovered that when two circles overlap one another and turn on a third center, one comes on top of it. So the impression, the third dimension or impression is given by the rotation of a certain drawing. So I made 12 drawings at that time called the auto relief.
Optical experiments have been taken up and developed by younger artists working today.
Yeah, but not my experiments, because these things are as old as Adam and Eve, you know, the optical things. Or instead of that, they just have taken it as a new form of expression. But I'm not responsible for that entirely, except that I had also the same idea some time ago, and did but very little of it, because I think it's a short duration, because it'd be too much repetition and monotony. I paid my dentist in Paris with a check, but the check was handmade by me on a bank that did not exist. So the man was nice. I asked him how much I owed him and made a check to that amount, and he accepted it, Dr. Zonk. And he's a very nice man, so nice that 20 years or 15 years later I bought back the check, with much more money than was written on the check.
Perhaps we should have it hinged from the wall, Michael.
I think definitely ought to be out at an angle, because what's so nice about it going like this is that the whole thing becomes ambiguous, and you'll see that there's also an ambiguous door, which can close one opening or the other, but never both.
Yes. If we do put it on hinges, then there'll be the possibility of it being pulled out this way, or lying flat against the wall.
Ever since his childhood in Normandy, surrounded by his family, Duchamp has played chess. He's played in tournaments around Europe. and the game, with its elements of movement and intellect, is very much in keeping with his artistic experiments.
A game of chess can be artistic, decidedly, because it's a visual form of movements. It's not static, it's already kinetic, if you want to say. It's a movement, it's a mechanical form of action. The bishop takes the bishop, the pawn moves, and so forth. In other words, when you look at a game of chess, you don't look at a game of chess as a visual, static thing. There's nothing beautiful in the sight of a chess game in progress. But when you play the game, the different movements, the succession of different movements, has a beauty of its own, which can be artistic, very often is.
It's impossible to summarize Duchamp. Perhaps this quotation from Paul Valéry gets near it. The artist is like a player, forever harried by new combinations of the game, haunted nightly by the spectre of the chessboard, obsessed with tactical images and solutions more living than real ones.
The commentary and interviews in that film were done by Tristram Powell, who also directed it. The Duchamp exhibition continues at the Tate Gallery till the end of July. We'll be back in a fortnight's time with the usual 3 or 4 items, one of which will be a report from Senegal on the Negro Festival of the Arts. Another will be an interview with Dan Jacobson, author of The Beginners. That's on the 7th of July. Good night.